So today's Learning Lab is a collaboration between two research consortia, Strive, as usual, and also Resist. Resist is, like Strive, it's funded by UK aid through DFID, with partners in several countries in Africa and Asia, doing health policy and systems research, and Resist focuses on three critical health system components. That's financing, health workforce, and governance. And interestingly, they focus on learning across contexts, drawing lessons from middle-income countries to adapt for health systems in low-income countries, as well as other cross-contextual learning. So that's a really interesting program, and Strive and Resist have collaborated a number of ways in the past, and I'm sure will continue to do so. Then, for anyone who doesn't know anything about Strive, we're a DFID-funded research program consortium, which is called an RPC in DFID terms, and we investigate the structural factors that drive HIV vulnerability. So in particular, we look at things like alcohol availability and drinking norms, gender inequality and partner violence, and also stigma around HIV and stigma against groups such as sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender people. And we look at the associations across some of these factors. So today, as you can see, we're learning about using altmetrics to track conversations about our research. So on behalf of Resist and Strive, welcome to Natalia Madjarevic. Apologies for pronunciation. And Natalia is responsible for the training program for an organization called Altmetric. And she has an impressive background in libraries and with open access and bibliometrics in various UK universities, and before that at the Guardian newspaper. So Natalia's passion for digital scholarship makes her the ideal person to help us all understand more about the altmetrics movement and how we can all improve and track the reach and impact of our research. There will be time for questions and answers in the later section after the presentation. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Annie, and hello everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak on this webinar today. And as Annie mentioned, I'm the Training and Implementation Manager at a company called Altmetric, and we're a London-based startup, and we track and measure attention and online activity surrounding research papers online. And as Annie also mentioned, I'm a librarian, or I was a librarian in my previous role, and part of my kind of previous activities involved supporting researchers to disseminate their work via open access, and also to understand, well, what kind of activity is going on around my research online, as well as looking at citation counts and those kinds of academic indicators of impact. It's now increasingly important that researchers are able to understand, well, what are the kind of broader societal discussions surrounding my research. So that's what we do at Altmetric. So today in the webinar, this is the main points I'm going to be covering. So first of all, thinking about what altmetrics and the altmetrics movement can tell us about attention to research online. I'll also cover the emergence of altmetrics and give you some tips for interpreting the data. And with the various tools that we build here at Altmetric, I'll cover the different sources of attention. So those are the places online where research might be discussed. I'll talk about which sources then we track and the various tools that we have on offer, particularly the free tool. I'll give you a demo and show you how that works. And finally, I'm going to give some examples of HIV research and talk you through some of the attention that they've received and look at the importance of analysing and understanding the qualitative data that we pull in at Altmetric. So first of all, thinking about the emergence of altmetrics and the altmetric movement. So I think it's first of all really important to understand, well, what does altmetrics mean? And this is something that I was just talking to Annie about before the webinar began, which is when I was working in libraries and working with researchers quite closely, it was quite common that many people had heard of altmetrics or the phrase altmetrics, or maybe even seen this logo, the altmetric badge, on various publisher and researcher pages, but maybe didn't have practical ideas or examples of how they could use altmetrics to understand their own research or to understand kind of what were the top papers in their specific discipline. So I think that's what I want to leave you with today, kind of those practical examples and a really clear understanding of what exactly altmetrics are. So here in this slide you can see kind of here's my definition of altmetrics. This is what I talk about when I talk about altmetrics. So altmetrics are attention to research outputs across non-traditional sources. So that could be a research output such as a journal article is mentioned in a policy document, or perhaps it's referenced in a news source, mentioned in a blog post, or it could also be shared on social media such as Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and so on. So altmetrics also stands for alternative metrics or article level metrics in some fields. And it's kind of a tricky name, altmetrics, in two ways really, because the alternative in altmetrics, we don't really see ourselves as being alternative. So we really see altmetrics to be complementary to existing forms of understanding conversations and potential impact of research. So that's the first way that's kind of a tricky name. The second part of the name, metrics, is also kind of slightly misleading in that we try not to focus too much on the metrics and the scores that we kind of pull in around research attention, and really to focus on the quality of the mention. So where was this paper discussed? Why was it mentioned? And did that lead to any tangible impact? So what altmetrics do is it helps researchers and organisations pull in and collect all of those conversations, but the real value lies in looking beyond the metrics and looking at the qualitative data and understanding, well, what were these conversations and how can we use that information to better understand our potential research impact and reach. So altmetrics are always an indicator of research impact. Just because a paper has had a lot of attention doesn't necessarily mean that it's a high impact paper. It could just mean that lots of people disagreed with it. Just as the same with any metrics such as citation counts. A paper with high citation counts could have been completely disagreed with and that was why it was highly cited. Or it could be that it was a seminal paper in that field and that's why it was highly cited. So think of the metrics and the numbers around each paper to be an exclamation mark to look further and understand what was going on around that item. So as you can see from this slide, we see altmetrics as being complementary to, on the left, the traditional academic attention. So that's things like the journal impact factor, citation counts, the H-index, those traditional bibliometrics that you can find on databases such as Scopus and Web of Science and Google Scholar. And then altmetrics, look at that broader societal online attention. So here you can see in this yellow circle some of the examples of the places where we go when we search for mentions of research. So in news, in policy, in social media, Wikipedia, reference managers, and so on. We also really kind of think that the importance of looking at the broader bigger picture. So altmetrics help you have a more coherent understanding of the potential impact of your research. So rather than just looking at one metric in isolation, we think altmetrics should be used alongside all of your existing forms and methods to understand the reach of research. So that's your definition. So why use altmetrics? What are the benefits of looking at altmetrics as well as citations and traditional peer review and so on? Well, first of all, it helps you understand attention beyond just journal articles. So we track anything with a unique identifier. That's how it works under the hood. So anything with a digital object identifier, a DOI, or another type of unique ID, such as a PubMed ID, SSRN, and so on. As long as an item or a research output has one of those unique IDs, we can track it. So things like data sets, posters presented at conferences, maybe a slide deck that you've shared on a website and you've minted a DOI for that item. We can track it and you can then collect the data and the broader attention around those outputs. So it gives researchers who maybe don't produce journal articles as a standard, but maybe they share their data sets or they produce software, for example. It helps those researchers get credit for creating those non-journal article outputs. It's also useful for early career researchers, particularly for those early career researchers who maybe have published 1 to 2 papers, and as I'm sure you all know with citations, they can take several years to accrue depending on the discipline. So with Altmetrics, it's often we can track the attention to a particular paper as soon as an item is published. And that helps early career researchers say, okay, so I published this paper, or maybe it was their thesis, and from the date of publication and from the date that item has a DOI, they can track and demonstrate kind of the broader engagement with their research before the citations have accrued. And then finally, another idea of kind of why you would use Altmetrics is to get that real-time, immediate feedback on attention to your research, but also the dissemination of your content. Where is it being read? Is it open access? Is that increasing the conversations around your paper? And so on. So another key thing, and something that's quite prominent here in the UK in terms of considering research impact, is how do you why and how are you required or asked to demonstrate research impact? So I pulled out this quotation here from a professor at UCL that I just thought that kind of really hit the nail on the head for me in terms of thinking about what does impact mean. And he said all impact means is that we're engaged with the world and trying to make it a better place to live in. And there are other kind of more wordy definitions of impact, but that I think is just a really great way to think about, well, what is a researcher doing with their research? Are they making it a better place to live in? So in terms of thinking about impact, I always think about it in the way that it's how does a piece of research contribute or change the way that something happens in the real world? So does it improve working practices? Does it lead to a policy change, maybe, over government ID cards, for example? Or does it change the way a team of healthcare practitioners treat an illness? Or does it provoke debate in society, and so on? And that's the kind of impact that by looking at kind of attention and discussion around research, digging deeper and finding out, well, where can we identify the actual identifiable differences that this research has made? That's what by looking at those policy document mentions and looking beyond and reading the specific mentions and understanding those conversations, that will help you better understand your impact. So that brings me on to thinking about, well, how do we do this in terms of Altmetrics? How do we understand impact? How do we demonstrate that to funders? And how does that work alongside Altmetrics? Well, I think about Altmetrics in these kind of 3 different kind of levels of attention. So first of all, we have the top level, which is when someone pays attention to a research paper across our online sources. So first of all, it could be a retweet or a share, for example. So that has portrayed a kind of a basic level of engagement with that research item. And then the next level in terms of thinking about this kind of spectrum of impact is engagement. So by looking at the mentions for a specific paper, you might be able to see a blog post that analyses the research, or a discussion, or maybe there's a review on something like Faculty of 1000 provided by an expert in that particular field. By looking at those mentions, that's how you can kind of uncover broader engagement rather than simply attention. And then the next step is impact, and this is kind of the area that you really want to find is how do I identify significant impact? So how has my research shaped policy or influenced working practices? And those are the kinds of mentions that you need to dig deeper and look at those policy mentions in order to find actual tangible changes to the way the world works. So really, it's important to look at that underlying qualitative data and that you'll find using tools like Altmetric. So first of all, what type of attention is this research receiving? Where has it received the most traction? So you might be able to look at the geographical locations of the people who have shared that research to see if it's engaged a particular audience. Maybe there's a particular country that the research is based around and you want to identify if there has been any traction or engagement in that area. How the articles influence policy, as I've already discussed. And of course, by reading those underlying mentions, you'll also be able to see if the reactions to the output have been positive or negative. And by looking at simply the score of a paper, so the altmetric score, for example, that gives you that indicator that a paper has received a lot of attention if that number is high, but it doesn't necessarily indicate that it's a high quality paper or a high quality researcher, and it certainly doesn't tell you the whole story, but it does provide that exclamation mark to go and look further and find out more about why that research had a lot of attention. So, how are institutions using this data? So, first of all, let's think about researchers. Researchers are using Altmetric to track attention to their research straight away, so as soon as it's got a DOI rather than waiting for citations to accrue. And one of the most common use cases we hear here at Altmetric is that it helps researchers to uncover conversations around their papers that they had no idea were going on. So, for example, their research was mentioned in the New York Times, or it was mentioned in a kind of World Bank policy document, and they had no idea. Because we do all of that hard work of scraping websites and searching for mentions to research, we kind of help surface that for researchers. And also for the final research use case is thinking about using altmetrics in grant applications and funder reporting. So using altmetrics and the data as a way to signal broader societal engagement for a potential grant, for past papers, or in order to apply for a grant, or to report to an existing grant to explain how that research and how that money led to further societal engagement. So librarians supporting researchers and providing that kind of central service to answer questions about altmetrics. And various other use cases across institutions that you can see here, so I won't go through them all, and we'll circulate these slides afterwards so you can take a look at those. But just some ideas of how researchers and different groups across universities are using the data. Okay, so that's the kind of introduction to the emergence of altmetrics and various thoughts on looking beyond the metrics and looking at that qualitative data. So next I want to give you some examples of, okay, so we understand kind of the theory behind altmetrics, but what does it look like? You know, what can we learn about specific articles? So I had a look, I've done some digging, and pulled out some examples of HIV research using our database, the Altmetric Explorer, and this is what I found. So first of all, I had a look, I just did a keyword search for HIV, and this is kind of the highest scoring HIV research paper in the Altmetric database. So bear in mind that this score is just kind of a score of attention, and we can see from the Altmetric donut in the top right of this slide here, it's multicoloured, which means it's had a lot of attention across different sources. So what was this article about? Bear in mind, disclaimer here, I'm not an HIV researcher or expert, I'm on the Altmetric side, but you can see from this paper, it was published in Nature in June this year, and it discussed a possible vaccine. So it got lots of attention, and we can see on the right here some of the coverage that this paper received. So it was discussed across 39 different news sources, including The Guardian, The Conversation. A professor from the University of Reading wrote an analysis piece in The Conversation. There were 10 blog posts about this paper, over 251 tweets, and with an upper bound, which means a potential Twitter reach of 688,000. 8 Facebook posts. It was recommended on Faculty of 1000 Prime, which is a website that recommends research outputs, and those recommendations are written by experts in that field. And then finally, it was also mentioned on YouTube and Google+. So I've pulled out, it was tweeted by USAID, and here's that Faculty of 1000 post on the left. So that's just a snapshot of some of the mentions and the high level of attention that this paper received. So we can think of this as kind of at the top of our spectrum. So it received lots of attention and public engagement shortly after publication. So I looked at this paper just a few days ago. So already it was published 3 or 4 months ago, but already it's got an Altmetric score of 523 and a really large number of conversations and discussions around that item. So if this was your paper, you'd be able to kind of demonstrate lots of public engagement and attention to your research immediately after publication. However, let's have a look at a different example. So that's the highest scoring paper. Next, let's have a look at this paper. Here we've got an altmetric score of 9, and we can see in the top right-hand corner the altmetric donut with the blue, purple and dark blue, which means it's been discussed on Twitter, and on Facebook and in a policy document as well. And it's got this score of 9. So what does that mean? Does that mean that it hasn't had as much impact? Well, let's have a look at a closer look at the qualitative data and the underlying mentions for this paper. So first of all, what was it about? It was published in AIDS and Behaviour. It's a 2011 article, and it followed a group and analysed their enrolment in counselling and testing for HIV in rural Kenya. So where and how was it discussed? So it was mentioned in a World Health Organization guideline for policymakers and managers, and it gave practical recommendations for application and local attention in order to kind of encourage positive outcomes. So you can see by just looking at that policy mention that this research has had an actual practical, tangible difference to the way the World Health Organization makes recommendations for managers working in this field. We can also see by looking at the Mendeley readership, and Mendeley is a reference manager and software like EndNote. By looking at that readership, we can see readers in the local area where the research was based in Kenya, and we can also see Twitter mentions in Kenya as well. So if you produced this research, or if you were interested in understanding if this paper had had impact or attention in the local area where the research was based, we can see that by looking at the geographical data for Twitter and Mendeley users. Next, let's look at my final example. So this is a final paper that I looked at, and we can see in the top right it's got this altmetric score of 55, and it's received attention across Mendeley, Faculty of 1000 Prime, and various news outlets and blog sources, and Wikipedia as well. So just a few mentions. It was a science article. I'm not even going to try and read the title of this paper, but you can see it in the top left of my slide. But by looking at the Mendeley readership, so we can see, I don't know if you can see just above the map in the slide there, that this paper has received, it has 378 readers on Mendeley, and we can see the geographical reach of those different Mendeley readers around the world. So we can see from this paper that although it's had relatively few mentions across news blogs and Twitter and so on, it does have those 378 readers on Mendeley, which indicates that this paper has quite a high following within the academic group. So altmetrics not only give you an understanding of kind of the broader societal engagement on things like social media and blogs and the news, but also helps you understand what type of academic engagement is a paper receiving by looking at these kind of statistics on sources like Mendeley. And there have been several studies in altmetrics research that have shown that Mendeley readership has a positive correlation with future citations. So if a paper has lots of readers on Mendeley, it's likely that that paper will be highly cited in the future. So there's 3 different examples of papers with high attention, potentially high impact by looking at the policy dimensions, and then finally high academic engagement. So next I want to talk you through some practical ways for how you can find this data and talk you through altmetrics tools and how that works here at Altmetric. So what we do is we go and we track and find all of these mentions of research outputs across the web. So to give you an idea of the numbers that we're talking about here, every day we track around 44,000 new mentions of research across all of our different sources. So that's one mention every 2 seconds. Every week we track over 50,000 unique items being shared, and to date we've tracked over 4 million scholarly outputs, and that's over 18 million mentions. So just by kind of thinking about all of those numbers, it really gives you a kind of a clear, the clear message is that there is lots of conversation and attention to research being shared and discussed online, and I think that's a kind of a data set that's ready and waiting to be interrogated in order to understand how research in your field or in your institution or your own research is being discussed in order to understand your future kind of what type of impact and engagement your research receives. So that's the numbers. So what sources do we track? I've mentioned a few in the examples, but here in the slides you can see the broad range of different types of sources. So when I first got into Altmetrics a few years ago, I was under the impression that it was just about social media. But as you can see from this slide, social media is very much a central and important source of data where we go and look for mentions of research papers. But it's just kind of one of our kind of areas of one of our sources. So in terms of social media, we track Twitter, Facebook, Google+, public posts only. So if a post is behind a private account, for example, we wouldn't be able to pick up on that. We also track post-publication peer review sites like Publons and PubPeer, and where researchers will write reviews of research papers on an open access database. Policy documents, so we track a number of different policy document sources. So we see an example from the World Health Organization, but we also track the World Bank, NICE Evidence, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and many more. Other sources, Wikipedia, YouTube, so that's if someone links to a paper in a YouTube comment rather than in the videos. We can't watch them all, unfortunately. Reddit, Faculty of 1000, and so on. Reference managers, so we track the read accounts, so whenever somebody adds a paper to their Mendeley or Cite You Like library, we collect the read accounts. We don't contribute those counts to the final Altmetric score that you saw in the centre of the donuts. The reason for that is you'll always be able to click back to the original mentions from the Altmetric data. So you'll always be able to click back to the original tweet or the original Facebook or news post. And with the reference manager numbers, we can just show you the number of readers rather than showing you who that specific reader was. So that's why we don't contribute that to the final score. And then finally, news outlets. So we track over 1,300 news sites. So that's a manually curated list that we select news outlets. But it's an international kind of coverage of news sources that we do track. So that can be anything from local, regional, international news, and different types of news sources. So that's a little bit about our sources. How can you get access to this data? So I'm hoping that's what you're all thinking. I want to have a go at my computer right now. So first thing I would recommend doing this is installing the Altmetric Bookmarklet. This is a free app, and you can just go to http://altmetric.it. When you go to that website, you'll see a button which you can drag onto your toolbar. Then what you can do is when you're on a journal article site, so you're reading this paper over your coffee in the morning and you want to know, well, how was this paper discussed? What type of societal attention did it get? And what were the discussions? How much was it discussed? You can just hit the Altmetric button in your toolbar, and then in the top right of the page, you'll see the Altmetric popover box, and then you can click for more details, and then you can see the Altmetric details page for that specific paper. And this is where you can see all of the conversations, all of the attention that we have tracked for that specific item. So you can monitor the mentions in the news, you can look at the score, and you can see the legend for the score below. And this is where you'll always be able to click back to the original mention in order to kind of read further and understand why that paper was mentioned or why that paper was referenced in the policy document, and so on. So that's the details page in the bookmarklet. So I'd really recommend taking a look at that tool in order to kind of to use and think about how you can track and look at the attention surrounding research that you read. You might also be familiar with seeing the Altmetric badges on publisher pages, as I mentioned at the start. So that's a very similar page that you would come to here, and you'll be able to see all the full mentions for that specific paper when you click on a badge. So, the details page. I talked about the donut a little bit, but just to kind of explain in a bit more detail what the donut does and what the score is. First of all, the donut, think of it as a visualization of all of the attention that a paper has received. And it's color-coded, so that's fairly straightforward. You can see the legend on the left, but this donut with and this paper with an Altmetric score of 2201, and it's received attention across Twitter, news, blogs, Facebook, and so on. And I can see that because it's a color-coded donut. So that's a really kind of quick shorthand way of looking at the attention and the discussions around a specific paper in order to see, oh, there's lots of blue in this donut. That means this paper's had a lot of attention on Twitter. Maybe I'll look further and kind of see what those conversations were. And the score of attention is exactly that. It's that indicator that a paper has received a lot of attention that we have calculated, and by looking at the different sources and the frequency with which a paper was shared. So those are kind of that's a summary of the donut and the score of attention. I wanted to kind of end with some kind of final ideas of how you want to how you might use altmetrics in practice. One popular use case that we hear among researchers as well is using the tool in order to track and filter through popular papers that they might want to read in their specific field of research. So how do I keep up to date with kind of the most important paper in my field? Maybe I should run a search and look at the altmetrics for a specific paper. You know, how do I know if it's kind of hot and popular at the moment? Well, by using the bookmarklet and clicking the altmetric button, you can see if a paper has had a lot of attention, and you might want to kind of go and look further and read the paper yourself and read the mentions around it. Also, what we've worked with the researchers that are using altmetrics to identify potential collaborators. So how do you find researchers who are also working in your field? Well, maybe you'd run a Google Scholar search or search Scopus, but how do you find other researchers in your field who are also having lots of societal engagement or an attention to their research? Well, you might want to run a search in something like the Altmetric Explorer, and that's how you would then identify papers with lots of attention that you could go and look further and see those conversations and how they are disseminating their research in order to maybe work and collaborate with that researcher in the future. So I've kind of walked you through an introduction to altmetrics and given you some examples of HIV research with attention, and then finally kind of finished off with some examples of how you can get your hands on this data. So I hope you found that useful, and I hope you kind of now kind of have an understanding of what altmetrics are and how you might use them. So does anybody have any questions?
Natalia, thanks so much. That was great. I'm glad that Michelle has put the link in the sidebar so that within the next week you'll be able to get the slides and the video of this presentation, because I'm sure, like me, you're thinking, I wish that at least 17 other people that I can think of immediately were part of this call, but you will be able to share that within a week or so. Okay, now we have a question from Mandip.
So, what do altmetrics mean for the future of more traditional citation-based measures of academic impact, particularly the journal impact factor? That's a really good question, Mandeep, and something I kind of only hinted at the start. But something that we see as being really important is that altmetrics help you have kind of a broader understanding of, rather than looking at just the journal impact factor or just using traditional citation-based measures to understand research impact. Altmetrics help you kind of tell another part of the story. So we don't think that altmetrics are here to kind of replace the journal impact factor, but we do think there are particular kind of issues with the way in which the journal impact factor is calculated and the way that it is kind of used at the journal level. We think because altmetrics are based at the article level and help you have kind of a better understanding of research discussion kind of more broadly across society, that you're more prepared and have a better, broader, more coherent understanding of research attention. So we don't think that they should replace traditional based analyses, but that they should complement them. So I hope that answers your question, Mandeep.
I think there's that same question I have from another colleague, Agnes Becker, also from the London School, and hers is more specific. It's will altmetrics as well as, or instead of citations, ever be used to promote a researcher? So this is not a question that we can expect Natalia to answer, but it is an interesting question for academics and universities in general.
Yeah, it really is, and I would hope not. I would hope that altmetrics are instead used to kind of have a better understanding of the work that a researcher might be doing to kind of disseminate their work and engage with their readers and broader society. But for that kind of evidence, you can find in the mentions to be used alongside lots of other measures rather than just using a single metric. And I think that's where the danger lies in using just one number or one single kind of indicator to make those decisions. Or metrics should be used to kind of help provide that better understanding.
I wonder if Natalia, if you'd like to go on to Joanna Wakia's question.
Yeah.
Does altmetrics work for grey literature, such as reports published by NGOs?
Yeah, Joanna, that's a good question. So as long as a report or a piece of grey literature has a unique identifier, so if it's in an institutional repository and it has a handle ID or an archive ID, for example, or ideally a DOI, a digital object identifier, we would then be able to track that output. The thing that we would need to know is we'd need to know the domain, so the domain of that institutional repository, because we try and track and follow mentions of all published content. So we follow nature.com and we follow ePrints and all of the kind of the sources that would link to research outputs. So we just need to make sure that grey literature and NGO reports have that unique identifier and that we know about the domain so that we can track it. So Joanna, if you do have an example of some outputs or grey literature that you want to make sure that we are tracking, feel free to email me on the email address on the slide here and I can take a look for you.
That's great. There's another question here from Rebecca Wolf from Resist, who was involved in organising this learning lab. She wants to know, how do you get DOIs for non-academic outputs such as policy briefs? So you've given us a general idea, but perhaps you can give us some more specifics on how to go about that. Yeah,
so to get a DOI, DOIs need to be minted just like an ISBN, and that's done through an organisation called DataCite. So that's usually done on the publisher side. So a publisher, when they produce a journal, they would get a DOI prefix and they would mint a DOI for every single item. But if you're producing policy briefs and outputs, you've got a couple of options. You could register with DataCite yourself and produce and mint the DOIs for those individual outputs. But if that isn't really an option and you don't want to kind of register with Crossref because there is a subscription involved, it's quite a small fee. But if that's not really feasible, another option is to use an open access repository such as Dryad or Figshare. You can deposit policy briefs there and that will then mint a DOI for that output. And then we'd be able to track those papers.
That's great. That's very practical. Thank you. There's another question now from Daniel Nyato. Is it possible to track what is happening in a particular context on a certain topic? And if so, how? Yeah, so another good question. So we have a database called the Altmetric Explorer. So you would need to have access to the Explorer. If you're a librarian, we can offer free access to the Explorer. Get in touch with us if you are and you want to have a look. And in the database, that's where you can go and run those searches. So you could search for a particular keyword, such as Ebola, for example, or maybe there's something going on in the news and you want to look at what are the most popular papers in that area at the moment. You could then run a search in the Altmetric Explorer. So that's how you can do it for a particular topic or area. Right. So presumably through our university. Yeah. So if your university has access, or if you're a librarian, you can access through us. Great. Then we have a question from Alexandra Chitty. Can you please repeat the names of the open access repositories that can be used to get DOIs for policy briefs and other non-academic publications and products? Dryad and Figshare.
But if you are a member of a university or a research organisation, you might have an institutional repository that you've got access to where you can deposit your papers. So you could speak to the team that work for the repository and see if they are able to register with Crossref and mint DOIs for your outputs. That's also an option.
There's another question from Manju Chatani, but before we get to that, I have a question. I think as we're at the London School, we have an online repository. I'm going to send out an example of a paper from my research group that's on the Research Online database, and that has an altmetrics icon and information. Who has added that? Is it the publisher? Is it the library? Because it's not. Is it our university? Because it's not available on all of them. Who is the person who's actually? Yeah,
good question. So in the link that Annie posted in the chat box, that goes to an LSHTM Research Online institutional repository record. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can see the impact and interest section, and that's where you can see the Altmetric donor that I've talked you through. And if you click on the view details on the Altmetric website, that takes you to the details page where you can see more information. This has been added to the London Schools repository by, I'm expecting, the repository team or the library and wherever that might be based. And that's because there's a plugin for ePrints, which is the software that this repository is based on. So this is kind of optional for institutional repositories, but it's free, and if you do have a repository system, you can add those badges and you'll be able to display the metrics and altmetrics around individual papers. You might also be familiar with seeing exactly this kind of badge on publisher pages, as I mentioned, so maybe like on nature.com or on an Elsevier journal article. That's been added to those journal pages, as you might expect, by the publisher. So they've asked Altmetric to provide the data, and they embed the badges so they can show their readers and their authors the broader conversations around their content.
Great, that's very helpful. Perhaps we can go back now to Manju Chatani's question. He wants to know, can advocates or advocacy groups also have access to the Altmetric database?
Yeah, Manju, if you get in touch, if you email me, Natalia at Altmetric, we can take a look just to explain, why you want to access the database, which organisation you're part of, and which group, and we'll get back to you.
I have another question here from Agnes Becker, who couldn't be with us, but will follow up later and had some questions. She says, I've seen mixed research on the number of tweets about a paper correlating with the number of citations of that paper. Can Twitter help increase a paper's citation or attention or discussion or impact? Are there ways, now I'm adding on to her question, that the altmetric information and analysis can help us work out? I think you mentioned already the attention to the capacity to follow things in real time. So clearly we could send out lots of tweets, tweet something, see that it's being retweeted or getting quite a lot of attention, and see in the moment what that does to the readership and discussion and so on. But are there any other ways that Altmetric can help us with that, and what are your views on Twitter and citation and attention?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thinking about can tweets predict citations? And you're right, there have been various studies that have looked at that exact question, and it's yet to be there needs to be more research in that area to find out, well, what is the result? Can tweets predict citations? I think the highest correlation that has been found in kind of the different altmetric sources that are tracked is, as I mentioned earlier, is reference managers. So things like Mendeley readership and Cite You Like readership, that has been found to have the highest and most positive correlation to predict future citations. And I think that kind of makes sense. If you think about the people who are adding papers to Mendeley libraries and Cite You Like libraries are likely to be academics who are reading those papers and then more likely to cite them in their future research. So that's thinking about correlations between altmetrics and citations. But to move on to the second part of the question, to think about, well, how can we use the data to kind of, share our research and learn from how, what that generates in terms of conversations. First of all, in terms of Twitter, I think it's really kind of a valuable, important tool to kind of share your research, particularly if it is open access, to get the tweets out there. It's very much one of our highest sources of attention, where we see the most conversations and most mentions of research, because it's such an active source and social media channel. So yes, I'd really recommend that being the first thing you do, is kind of make sure your research is out there. Link to your DOIs, link to your open access versions of your papers. One thing that we do is to avoid gaming. So if a publisher churns out kind of 20 tweets about their specific individual paper, we try and account for that. So we will also always only pay attention to the first mention of a journal article from a specific Twitter account, rather than counting 20 repeats of the same tweet. That kind of helps us avoid anyone trying to game the metrics. But as with any metrics, it can be gamed. But yeah, I would say that would be the first thing, to kind of get your stuff out on Twitter and blog about your research. There are lots of really good examples of research blogs that write kind of reviews or summaries of research papers in kind of an easy to read format, so that it's much more accessible for kind of anyone with a kind of a general understanding of the field. And I would say that would be my next tip, is to kind of make sure that your papers are shared on Twitter, and that you make an open access version, but that you then also kind of encourage your researchers, or you yourself write easy to read blog posts about your papers, and share that, and then see what kind of discussions you get by following the metrics using the bookmarklet.
That's great. I know we have some very good bloggers on the call, including Mandip, who asked a question earlier and who has a really effective blog.
Yeah.
I think everyone's dying to get onto your site, Natalia, and get cracking and add the bookmark and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So this is a last chance for any more questions. And if not, anything you'd like to add before the end, Natalia?
Yeah, I just kind of want to leave you with the thought that, that think about altmetrics as having kind of another kind of tool in your toolbox to understand your research and kind of track that attention. So, maybe if you are going in for another kind of meeting with your supervisor, or you want to find what's the next top paper in your field, have a look at the metrics and see if there's anything you can pull from that data in order to demonstrate some broader engagement, or to find something that you might really want to kind of go through and read in order to broaden and filter your reading. And if you have any questions about anything I've covered, please feel free to get in touch with us at Altmetric. You can tweet us, we're at Altmetric, and we're more than happy to help, and we'd love to hear from you.
Brilliant. Natalia, thanks so much, and thanks to Becky Wolf for helping to organise this. Thanks again, Natalia, and thanks to everyone for joining us.